Good evening, everyone. Come on in the room. Cease's Rants and Musings is back. Yay. Come on in. Come on in. Come on in the room. Let me know that you're here. Good evening, everyone. It's good to be back. Come on in. Good evening, Sister Drum Go Kilgore. Hey, Deidre. Come on in the room. We have an awesome show for you tonight. We are definitely excited. Yes. Come on in. Come on in. Give people a few minutes. Hey, Jamie. Hey, Alana. I miss you guys so much. I feel like I haven't seen you guys in so long. And thank you, Jamie. Come on in. We're talking tonight about good stuff. Don't want you to miss it. Please invite and share someone, especially anyone struggling with mental health conditions or issues. This is what it's about. Healing is the hashtag healing is the only agenda. So we want people to get information that can help them become healed and made whole. Come on in, everyone. I'm going to give it just a few more minutes just to get some of my people who are typically on a chance to get in. We've been missing for 2 weeks, but for good reasons. We had to be on to see the, thank you, Alana. We had to be on to see the Democratic National Convention. And then last week, I was traveling for the march in DC, which was absolutely amazing. I have on my Black Lives Matter shirt. I am still on a high just from that experience. The energy at the convention, at the march, and the diversity at the march, and the amount of people. They said there was over 200,000 people there. And just the speeches and being such an important day, seeing that it was the 57th anniversary of Martin Luther King's speech in that very place. Everything about it was just amazing. And I don't know if you guys got to see, but I was featured on BBC News, giving my opinion. By the time you see me, I'm like railing, right? But that's because I was talking over even 15 minutes. I was giving them a semi-sermon. They might not have knew that, but I was going in. So the clip that you see is me being really passionate and going in, but I had been on that high for a minute. But it was an amazing, amazing experience. I'm grateful that I was able to attend. But again, it's unfortunate that we even have to have done that. Oh, good, Jamie. It's unfortunate that we even had to be there. We can't get caught up in, people like, yes, I'm an activist. I shouldn't have to be an activist, right? Why should I have to be an activist? If everyone was treated like a human being, if everyone had the same rights, if there wasn't a conscious, systematic attempt to kill Black people physically, spiritually, emotionally, health-wise, educationally, we wouldn't have to be doing all this marching and all of this activism. Hey, Cousin Eunice. So good you're on. So come on, let's get started. I want to give as much time as I can to this topic. And I think you're definitely going to enjoy it. Good evening and welcome back to Teachers Rants and Musings. I have missed you all, but we are back at it because hashtag healing is the only agenda. So this is why we're doing what we're doing, because we need to be made whole. The journey towards wholeness is one that is continual. So we are in it, and God has just been blessing us. I have received so much feedback about how the show has been helping people and inspiring people And to me, if one person walks away feeling like they've been helped, I've done my job. So I don't get caught up in the numbers. I don't get caught up in all of that other stuff. I just want to know that it helped somebody and somebody was being blessed by it. And I am confident that God is with us. And I'm so glad you guys are with us tonight. It is September. Can you believe it? We are already in September. We have been in this pandemic for what, since March, and it's been seemingly forever. But we're still here. Thank God we're still able to have breath and to even have this conversation and this platform. But September is the ninth month. And in the ninth month, it has so much symbolism, right? The ninth month being the month of birthing, being the month of giving birth and of purpose. But September is also known as the month for suicide awareness and prevention. And we just have to start talking about this. Some of you who go to my church, you know, the last time I preached at my church on a Sunday morning, it was about suicide and the prophet Elijah and how he suffered from depression, how we don't talk about these things in our spaces, and especially in our communities of color. So tonight I have with us our resident therapist, and she is coming back because this topic is so near and dear to her heart. So I want you to understand that when I ask people to come on, I'm not asking them because they're my friends. I'm not asking them because I think it's fun to have them on. I'm asking them because they have the expertise and the knowledge about what we're talking about more than anyone else I know, and because they are passionate about these topics. So they're not just giving us what they know theoretically, they're giving us what they know by experience, what they have been working in and with throughout their careers. So I'm giving you people who are the real deal. This woman is the real deal. She's a friend, but she's also a great therapist. She's a woman of God, but she has a lot of passion about these things. And she's also been able to come into the communities of color and share that passion with us and help us get to where we want to go and be and jump on the bandwagon towards healing and wholeness. And so for that, I am honored and privileged to bring back to the show Kristin Miller.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
Who will be sharing with us about suicide awareness and prevention. So, for those who don't know, Kristin has her own therapeutic counseling center called Mosaic Counseling. So she's a full-time therapist. She's also a professor at Seton Hall for their School of Social Work. But why don't you tell us, Kristin, a little bit about why this topic is so near and dear to your heart?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for having me back. I am really excited to be back tonight. So suicide prevention is something that I am extremely, extremely passionate about. For most of my career, right, I've worked with adults, adolescents, and even children as young as 6 years old who have been struggling with suicidal ideation. And in my own journey, I really used to struggle significantly with major depression. And so with the right supports, right, with my faith, right, my relationship with God, with therapy, and with good, close friends that I could confide in, right, that's something that I have been able to overcome. So I have a really good understanding of what it really feels like to be depressed. And then some years ago, I lost my sister-in-law to suicide. And so that experience just really unraveled me. It was a really difficult and painful process. And so after that experience in particular, I started volunteering with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention And so part of what we're going to talk about tonight is really based on one of the trainings that I do for them. So I'm a volunteer trainer, and I can go out and present for free. It's something that's offered for free because they're really passionate about getting the word out and helping people understand. So there are various presentations for schools, for educators, and the one where we're going to pull some of the information tonight is called Talk Saves Lives, and it's a presentation that is designed for non-mental health professionals, just anybody who wants to learn more about suicide prevention.
Wow. So just to clarify, when you say sister-in-law, you're talking about she was your sister-in-law?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yes.
Wow. Wow. That must have had a significant impact on your entire family.
Absolutely. And it was extremely challenging because I think one of the reasons it's so important for us to talk about these things is that even within our family system, I was really the only one who knew about the things that she was struggling with, right? Because there's often so much shame around struggling with suicidality, right? That people feel a lot of shame about having these thoughts. And so this was something that really was kept very secret, even from her own family. Her own biological family. And so, yeah, the grieving process afterwards was quite challenging, and especially for me being a therapist, right? Because those expectations I was placing on myself, right?
Right.
And I was feeling, even though I obviously wasn't her therapist, it was a tremendously painful process that actually took me back to therapy.
Wow. I can imagine.
Yeah, it was really, really challenging.
Wow.
But to God be the glory.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I didn't want to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, we appreciate you sharing that experience with us. I think it helps ground this conversation in a way that nothing else could. So why don't we get into it? As you mentioned, you have a presentation that you use. So let's talk about it. And let me just say this. Hey, cousins. I see my cousins have joined, and also that I think one of the reasons I'm passionate about this is that I'm always concerned about the intersectionality of mental health with faith, and how so often when it comes to mental health, the faith community is lagging significantly behind. We haven't necessarily caught up to understand what is going on with people. We still have old stigmas about mental health, and we still are, creating spaces for people to feel shame.
Yes.
And not to feel like they can share. And you talked about your sister-in-law feeling that shame and not sharing with even her own family members what she was dealing with. And so I'm passionate about this because, again, my feeling is this brokenness that we are walking around in, whether it's personal, whether it's communal, it's too expensive. It's costing us lives. It's costing us to lose people whom we love and should still be here. But because we don't know how to handle it, we haven't created safe spaces. We've still allowed people to feel shame about these things that we haven't been able to help. And as believers, because again, this show is still grounded in faith. As believers, we are supposed to be the hands of Jesus, the heart of Jesus, right? The voice of Jesus to those who are hurting and struggling. But we fall short so often because we don't have proper information. It's not deliberate all the time. It's just we don't know. We don't think sometimes we didn't know we should know. So I'm hoping you guys will share this live, that you will invite people to come in, because we keep thinking that it doesn't impact us because we think we don't know anyone who is feeling suicidal, right? Because then it's like, we don't think it's important because we don't think we know anyone who's struggling, when in fact, we could be sitting in a room full of people who are struggling. But
Yes.
because everyone else is thinking they're in it by themselves, or they don't want people to know what they're going through, nobody is saying anything.
Right.
So people are suffering in silence. We're missing the signs. So I appreciate you being here to talk with us and give us more information so that we can learn more and be there for people. So let's just start with this first slide that you have here for us that says suicide can be prevented. I I think that's no better place to start, right?
Yeah. And I think I like starting with this slide because I think it infuses hope into what can be a very heavy conversation, right? So, this idea that there are things we can do as individuals, right? Every person, not just me as a therapist, right? But there are things that any of us can do to really be there to provide support and hope. And part of being able to prevent it is being educated.
Yeah, yeah. And so you can lead me forward. We can go
Yeah.
through it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so how do we talk about this with people?
Right. So I think, like you were saying, just in general, we do want to learn how to talk about this. But one of the things that, right, we want to focus on is especially within the church, right, as followers of Jesus. What language are we using? Are we using language that stigmatizes suicidal ideation and further pushes people away and others them? Or are we using more compassionate language, right? So this is just something, a really small language change that can help decrease the stigma, right? So the idea of not saying committed suicide, right? Or somebody had a failed attempt, right? Because we actually wouldn't consider that a failure. If somebody survives a suicide attempt, that's an opportunity, right? To connect
Right.
with the right supports. Or to think that an attempt was successful, right? It's not a success if somebody literally ends their own life. These are just examples of recommended language. So we're not pretending that it wasn't what it was, right? But we're just using less stigmatizing language. So died by suicide, ended their life, killed themselves. So just a slight language change.
It's and I think language is so critical though, right? Because the communication that we send to people can either keep them in silence or make them feel more safe to disclose what they might be thinking and feeling. I've said committed suicide forever,
Mm-hmm.
and so this information for me is great because, as we learn more in life, right, we have to be open to tweaking how we've understood things that we thought we knew in the past. Things are changing all the time. The demographics are changing.
Yes.
Years ago, you would never have heard of anyone committing suicide amongst Black
Mm-hmm.
people. Now, the
Mm-hmm.
rates of suicide amongst Black young people is
Yeah.
going up. And
Yeah.
you would never have thought to talk about suicide amongst clergy.
Right.
But clergy, there's been a spike in clergy people who have, died by suicide. So I just think we have to start thinking broader about this and understanding this and being open to learning more about it. And it starts with the language.
Yeah.
So, what about completed suicide? I hear people say that term. Is that okay?
Yep. That would absolutely be okay. Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Simple things.
Yes.
All right.
Okay. So
Scope of the problem.
yes. So I think this is a really powerful slide, right? If we think about the idea that research would tell us that every 40 seconds, somebody dies by suicide, right?
Wow.
And the reality is that the numbers that we have are definitely lower than actual suicides, right? Because depending where in the world someone lives, or even different state requirements, there are different mandates for reporting suicides, right?
Wow.
That is something that's really underreported. And sometimes families may not want that on a death certificate because of the stigma. And so they may put other, a relevant cause, right? Sometimes it's unclear with a drug overdose, right? Was it an accidental drug overdose or was it a suicide? And so the numbers are actually far greater than this.
It's so interesting that you're saying this because I remember back in 2018, a young person jumping off the parking garage right there at Seton Hall.
Yes.
And the family was kind of disputing it being considered a suicide or something like that. And I think it was somewhat because of the stigma, if I remember it correctly. Like there was just I don't know if it was the family or the school, but someone didn't want it to be labeled a suicide because of what that would look like and what that would mean. And so to your point, what you're saying is if what's reported accurately says someone is dying every 40 seconds, imagine what it would be if they reported all of those types of suicide deaths accurately. It would be even higher. And this is in the world, right?
Yeah.
So it's so interesting. I remember traveling to, and I traveled to, where was I? Guyana. I did a touristy, tour to the falls. I forgot the name of the falls, but they're major falls they have there. I think Orandyke or something like this falls. And they used to not have barriers around the falls because it was, people just went and looked. You knew not to get to because you didn't want to die, right? But because the suicide rate was so high, and have been growing in the country, they had to start putting up barriers so people couldn't get as close to the edge anymore. Wow. And I just thought that was so sad and interesting. If you saw these falls, like this is no way to die. Wow. But they had to respond because people were just going there and jumping off. And it was just so sad. Sometimes we just think about what's happening in our little world, our little community. Right. But people are suffering around the world and they don't have access to this type of information. A good friend of mine who was in the Peace Corps there, that's exactly what her job was to go around doing suicide prevention education because the numbers were so high, Kristin. And it just breaks my heart because in most of these, especially these Caribbean countries, there's such a heavy faith-based They're such heavy faith-based countries. You have churches, a proliferation of churches all around, almost any kind that you want. And somehow it seems like, we haven't been able to address this and really work with this topic in a way that is saving lives as significantly as we needed to. Yeah. So, again, we can only do our part, but I just think it's so critical.
Yes.
Bringing it back home. So right here in the USA.
Yes. So the last year that we have statistics for is 2018, right? And the number of completed suicide in the United States has been increasing. And so in 2018, there were close to 48,500 completed suicides. And again, that number is likely higher because of reporting. So overall in the United States, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death. But if we start to look at different age groups, obviously, even for it being the 10th leading cause of death is problematic because it is something that's preventable. Yeah. But if you look at adults ages 35 to 54, suicide in that age group is the 4th leading cause of death. And then for...
Wait. Okay. Did you say 35 to what?
To 54.
35 to 54, what we would call middle age. Mm-hmm. It is the 4th leading cause of death.
the fourth leading cause.
Wow, that's so high.
Yes.
That's like after car crashes. I mean, like there's so many ways to die, right?
Yeah.
Diabetes, heart, problems, failure, hypertension, all those different things.
Yeah.
Suicide is actually fourth.
Yes.
Wow.
And so if that was your reaction to that statistic, the other one is even more mind-blowing. So when we look at children age 10, right, up to adults age 34, in that age group, suicide is the second leading cause of death. So really, really important that all of us are doing our part to really understand this and be able to talk more about it. Children, it's not that there's a large number of youth that are completing suicide, right? But if we just think of any number of 10-year-olds completing suicides, right? This is a really a crisis that we do need to address.
Wow. Janet, and hey, Janet has a good question. She's asked, can the reporting lag by almost 2 years? Like, how is suicide being reported in this COVID environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know if by the end of this year there may be statistics for 2019. So I'm not sure. Basically, a lot of the suicide reporting is coming from the CDC, and also sometimes from coroners. But again, there's different reporting laws from state to state. So yeah, but that's why it is September and we still don't have last year's data. And that's a great point. It'll be really interesting in 2021 when we think about all the COVID deaths, right, as a result of COVID. But if we think about all these different stressors that people are under, right, these double pandemics of COVID and racism, right, and then all the financial fallout, right, people losing jobs, right, lack of access to appropriate healthcare when they are sick. There's so many different things happening. So it will be interesting to look at those numbers next year.
It really will be. And, people are sharing how they have, experienced it in their families. Minister Hill said she lost her nephew to suicide. I mean, so it's hitting home in ways that we wouldn't have probably imagined, especially in the Black community years ago, right? It was just, oh, we don't kill ourselves, but it's changed. Things have changed. Times have changed. And it's a lot. So let me move us on.
Okay. So I think, again, if we're thinking about this idea that every 40 seconds somebody completes a suicide, right, statistics would show us that for every one completed suicide, 25 other people attempt. And again, these numbers are going to be much lower than they actually are, because this is attempts where people actually make it to an emergency room, right? And they get screened and they get admitted to the hospital, right? So I know many people that have attempted, but they never sought help at the time. So these numbers are likely much higher. But again, the hope that's woven into this is if people are attempting, those are opportunities for help. So that part I think is important to emphasize.
Wow.
Okay, so this is important as well, and it really talks about the idea that suicide is preventable. So 9 out of 10 people who die by suicide have a mental health condition that's contributing to their death, right? So that idea that people who are struggling with mental health issues, whether it is depression, whether it is severe anxiety, whether it's unresolved trauma, grief and loss, so important that people do get connected with the appropriate supports, because when they have those supports in place, then people can live healthy, fulfilling, and meaningful lives.
Wow. I think what's interesting is about this is I think we still underestimate what we mean by mental health condition. And I think on one of the episodes, like you helped us with that, where you can have um, like these conditions can range in severity,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I feel like sometimes it's become just the cliche to say, "Oh, she had a mental health issue," but we don't take it seriously. We aren't putting the emphasis that we need to put on making sure people are okay, because it's like, oh, everybody has one now, right? Like or it's so common now, or it's no more quote unquote stigma necessarily, so it's no big deal. But are we doing anything about it, right? So
Yeah.
understanding that the majority of people who complete suicide have some mental health condition, and it's a mental health condition that we ourselves may even experience. Depression, like you mentioned, anxiety, all of those different things. But it seems like we just are like, yeah, ho hum. It's almost like saying, oh yeah, she got sunburn. Like it's not being taken as serious, where so we're not doing the work to engage people to see if suicide ideation is even a part of what they're struggling with.
Yes. Yeah, and I think you're raising a great point, right? To again tie it to the church, right? And our faith is that generally people will take physical health conditions, right? If you get a physical health diagnosis, then people will generally, take things more seriously, right? And God cares just as much about our mental health as
Yes.
health. And so
Yes.
it's really something that is important to God, right?
Yeah.
Right? Your whole premise is healing is the only agenda. Well,
Yeah.
if we want the healing, we have to be willing to acknowledge, hey, I'm really struggling and I need some help. I need to figure out what supports I need to put in place so that I can achieve that healing and wellness.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, it's the only agenda, because when you don't deal with it, it usurps everything else.
Yeah.
Or it undermines the work you might be doing in other areas of your life. So if you haven't been made emotionally healed and whole, you tend to overeat. You tend to do so many other things that's going to impact your physical. Like it's all interrelated. So if you don't heal, it's still going to somehow show its ugly face in some aspect of your life and undermine the things that you're trying to do, and trying to live a purposeful life. All right, so let's take it further.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think this is important as well, right? So depending on which research people are looking at, it's either 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people will experience a mental health condition, and that most of those people don't go on to die by suicide, right? Which again, I think speaks to you can live with a mental health condition, right? And some mental health conditions can be resolved, right? Others, something like bipolar, right? Now we know we serve a God who is the ultimate healer. So if he decides he literally wants to touch somebody and heal them from any mental health condition, he can do
Right.
that, right? We know that he can. But there are also real biological things happening, right? If somebody has bipolar disorder, right? As of now, there's no cure for that. That's something that somebody will have to live with, right? And part of bipolar disorder is often major depressive episodes where people may experience suicidal ideation. But with the right supports, they can have healthy, productive lives.
Amen. And that's the hope, right? And that you talked about, because I think this slide says that it's not everybody that ends up going on. Just because you have this mental health issue doesn't mean you have to go down the road to suicide. Like that doesn't have to be your story. It doesn't have to be your loved one's story just because they have a mental health condition. So it gives that hope that you were talking about, that says we can try to do something about it if we can, and be educated and still be able to experience health and wholeness
Yes.
even if we have a diagnosis. Like, that's not the end of the story.
Right.
Thanks be to God.
Yes.
Ah, there we go.
Okay.
Now, I figured you would love this slide because of you and neurobiology.
That is true. I do love neurobiology. I was just talking to my students about that this morning. So again, I think when we're trying to reduce stigma and blaming people, right, for having suicidal ideation or attempting, right, there are literally differences in the brain of people who die by suicide, right, who from those who die from other causes, and specifically there are differences in the areas of the brain that relate to stress management and managing emotions. So it would actually make
Wow.
sense. There's this biological predisposition that it literally is different.
Wow. And that's so helpful to know too, because again, we keep making it about feelings. We
Yeah.
keep saying that suicide, that people are just feeling like they want, but something is actually happening in their brains, is happening physiologically to them that is causing them to go down this track. And they may have a mental health condition that is what's creating that issue. So
Absolutely.
I just think it's good to understand that this isn't about feeling sad today and feeling good tomorrow, or just making yourself feel better. There could be more things actually happening to people.
Yeah. Okay, so this is important too, because I think a lot of times when people may hear about someone completing a suicide, you may hear people saying, that was so selfish, right? How could they do that, right? And so I think it is important to highlight most people who are suicidal really are ambivalent. There is a part of them that wants to live, right? But there's another part of them that whatever pain they're experiencing, whether that's mental and emotional pain or physical pain, that there's a part of them that just wants it to stop, right? They just want relief from it. And so it starts to sometimes seem like it may be better if they weren't here, because then they wouldn't have to deal with any of those things.
Yeah. And it made me think of this, that suicide ideation or contemplation, however people want to call it, is not as uncommon as we would like to think. We tend to, when it's time, when we talk about topics like this, people shy away from it. They think, oh, they don't need to hear about it. They don't want to know about it. And they don't tell the truth that they may have thought about it themselves at a time in their life, because there's so much shame around it. Or they, excuse me, act as if, oh, they knew they would never do it.
Right.
I've heard someone say that, yeah, I thought about it, but I knew I would never do it. So as if it wasn't a real, though, thought and contemplation. And so I think, again, when we destigmatize it and when we start telling the truth, when we start showing people, especially in our faith, that someone like Elijah, after having come off of one of the greatest miracles ever seen, ends up under a tree asking God to just kill him, let him die. He's so depressed. He's grieving. Some of his friends have been murdered and killed, and now they're trying to kill him. He's in major crisis, and he wants to die. But we don't lift up that he's not the only one in the Bible, but that also, here is someone who was having a depressive episode.
Yes.
And he was a powerful man of God.
Right.
So we act as if these things don't happen to us, that it only happens to people who have severe mental health issues, and we stigmatize it so much, but it's not true.
Right.
It's not true. A lot of people have thought about it, and maybe again, that intervention was there, but the thoughts have been there for people.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so when we think about the perspective of a suicidal person, right? When someone is actively having thoughts of wanting to kill themselves, we're really talking about a crisis point, right? Where they're becoming desperate to escape the pain.
Right. And
their thinking becomes very limited. So they're not thinking rationally at that point.
That's good to understand, because if someone is is not in a rational or in their right state of mind, you know, how can they? They're not making a logical decision. So
Right.
to think, oh, they're just being selfish, or they just want attention. I've
Right.
heard that before. Or they
Mm-hmm.
just want attention, or they just, need to pray and rebuke that spirit off of them. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we've heard these things, assuming that this is a logical person trying to do an illogical act, when
Right.
really it's someone that's not in a great state of mind,
Right.
trying to do what only seems like the best option to
Mhm.
escape what they're experiencing.
Yeah,
That
absolutely.
gives you a whole different perspective on the struggle of that moment, the struggle
Mhm.
of that time that they're in, and how low they must be, and what they're feeling. If you don't have compassion for that, to
Yeah.
think that someone is feeling so much pain for regardless of what the
Right.
cause, that death would be better than this.
Mm-hmm.
Death would be better. And when I think of those clergy people, they had churches. These were pastors who
Yeah.
were beloved, with
Yeah.
families, young children. So what we're talking about? They were in some mental space that the thought of having leaving their children, the thought of didn't outweigh the thought of wanting to escape what must have been tormenting them.
Yes. Yes.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's a lot.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so it's important to think about three different categories of risk factors. So again, whether you're thinking about yourself or thinking about friends, loved ones, these three groups of risk factors, we'll probably try to quickly go through these.
Okay.
So you want to go to yeah, there we go. Okay, so health factors. So if anybody is diagnosed with any of these conditions, right? Depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, personality disorders, and that especially borderline personality disorder, there is a high correlation of having that particular diagnosis and suicidality. People who are psychotic, right? Psychosis, where people are hearing voices telling them to kill themselves, post-traumatic stress disorder, and substance use disorders. So again, we're not saying that these conditions cause people to attempt. It's just a correlation. So these would be risk factors that we want to look at, where we'd want to do a good, thorough assessment.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And then we want to think about physical health, right? So if we think about serious or chronic health conditions, chronic pain, and head injuries, right? So somebody who is diagnosed with sickle cell or fibromyalgia, and they're in this chronic pain off and on, right? Or someone who gets diagnosed with a terminal illness and they're in a lot of physical pain. Again, that can be a risk factor. Doesn't mean they're going to attempt, but these are things we want to consider in terms of weighing risk factors that may make someone more likely to attempt. Okay, then we want to look at our histories, right? So if there is a family history of completing suicide, someone is going to be more at risk. If there are mental health conditions on the maternal or paternal side of the family, that's a risk factor. Any type of child abuse, so physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect would all be risk factors. And if someone has previously attempted, they are more at risk. And then any significant losses, right? And so loss can apply to death, but it can also apply to end of relationships, right? That is a significant loss that people can really feel tremendously.
I think, to Janet's point, that this is why this topic is so important at this time right now too, because you have so many people who have had such significant losses in their families.
Yes.
We have people due to COVID who have lost their both parents. They have lost, a husband and a son, or they have lost, a wife and children, in one family, massive amounts of loss. So these are the people we have to check up on. These are the people we have to pay close attention to.
Yes.
I've always been interested in this correlation with the family history of suicide. Is it just, is it a biological predisposition, or is it just the knowledge that the father or parent or mother has committed suicide, or sibling, that then impacts how they see suicide? Like,
so I don't think there's any research that would talk about causality, right? That if somebody knows a parent did or another family member, that they're going to. I think it is much more about the biological or genetic predisposition for different mental health conditions, right?
Got it.
It would really be more, okay, if you know, depression, there's a genetic component, anxiety, bipolar disorder. But then there also are people that have witnessed a parent attempting, right? So just the trauma of that, for some people, that's going to cause them to say, I need to take really good care of myself to make sure I'm not ever in that position, right? Where I'm just feeling that, like you said, tormented. So it's generally not like a copycat kind of thing. It's much more
Got it.
And then we want to look at environmental factors. So access, right? If somebody is having suicidal ideation that they want to kill themselves with a gun, but they don't have access to a gun, right? That's helpful. So if anybody does have loved ones that have struggled with or do struggle with suicidal ideation, right? I'm thinking about some of the adolescents that I've worked with, right? If they had thoughts of taking pills, it would be working with their caregivers to, okay, let's make sure all pills in the house are locked up and put away. So what measures need to be taken so that people don't have because again, it's a crisis moment. And if people can get through those moments, then people are likely to be able to talk with somebody and get access to support. Exposure contagion, that often happens. Well, I shouldn't say it often happens, but when it is contagion, it really is about often the way the media is reporting something. So one of the guidelines that American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has given to media is that they want media to report when it is a suicide because we don't want to stigmatize it and pretend it's something else, but they should not list the means by which somebody completed the suicide, because that happens when the method is reported, and let's say it's you know, Kate Spade dies by suicide, right? Or Anthony Bourdain, right? It's this really well-known person. And then after that will be copycats of that particular method.
Right.
And so literally just not including the method. And that's something I pay attention to. So you would see where, I know with Kate Spade's death, in the initial reports, it did say how she completed, and then people had conversations, and then it was removed after that. I mean, then it's kind of too late. But, and that's news, right? So if there's a youth, right, that dies by suicide and they're putting the means, that's a problem. And then we want to think about prolonged stress and stressful life events, right? What we're living in now, prolonged stress events, right? COVID, right? For people of color, the daily stress and trauma of racism, right? Those are prolonged stresses. Stressful life events, death, divorce, losing a job, right? And so one of the things we want people to take from this is a lot of times, especially when something's reported, let's say somebody dies by suicide after a breakup, we automatically think the breakup caused the suicide, right? When really anybody participating in this Tisa's Rants and Musings, right? We've all had a breakup, right? That's just a common experience. So there are always multiple factors contributing to a completed suicide. There is never just one thing happened and now the person completed a suicide. There's always other things that we likely don't know.
Wow.
Okay, and then we want to focus on protective factors, right? So mental health care, we want to look at, does somebody have family and community support? Problem solving skills, right? So people who tend to look at problems as opportunities, right? And really have the ability to figure out, okay, this is a problem, I can tackle this, I can solve it. And then really significantly, cultural and religious beliefs, right? So again, I think it speaks to the importance of our faith communities being able to talk about these issues, because people's faith is a significant protective factor against suicide.
Definitely.
Okay. And then self-care strengthens mental health. So mental health care is not just therapy, right? There are things that we can do on a day-to-day basis to enhance our mental health. So all of these things are really self-explanatory, simple things, but we have to create the time for them, right? We live in this really fast-paced society where most people, and especially most women, don't take time to nurture themselves, right? It's focused on, let me take care of everybody else. And then we're wondering why we're depleted, right? So really important, even if you're just putting in something 15 minutes a day for yourself. Okay, so the most important thing you can put between a suicidal person and their way of ending their life is time. Okay, so we can yeah. Because literally, if you can get to the person in that moment, most suicidal thoughts will pass. Most of them will pass. And so if you can get to the person in that moment, and we talked about the limiting access, so we can skip that one. Okay, so we want to watch for the warning signs, reach out, and seek help. So we're going to talk about warning signs. So this is broken down into 3 different types of warning signs. So talk, behavior, and mood. So again, if you're thinking about loved ones, you want to be listening for this kind of talk. So talk about ending their life, right? And so that's something we want to take seriously, because sometimes, and I've seen this in a lot of the families I've worked with, right? Where there's been either an adult or an adolescent, and they're expressing that thought, like, I just don't want to live anymore, right? And, or, you know, I don't know, I'm thinking about killing myself. And oftentimes family response is, stop talking like that. Stop talking crazy.
Right.
And so again, we really want to understand, right? So it's important to just ask something as simple as, what do you mean by that? Right? Because sometimes people do just say, and I've, again, having had the life experiences I have, I always pay attention to language. But I remember probably a week after I returned to work after the loss of my sister-in-law, my boss, and she knew what happened because I had shared it with her. I'd taken a week off, and we're in a team meeting, and she's like, oh my gosh, she's like, if this person doesn't get it together, I'm going to throw myself off the building. Right. And
oh my goodness.
So she and I had a conversation about it, and I knew she didn't mean anything by it. Right. But just the idea that when we say things like that, and you never know when you're in the presence of someone who really is struggling with suicidal ideation or has lost someone to suicide. But people often say that when they're stressed. Oh my gosh, I'm going to kill myself. But you always want to ask, because otherwise you don't know. And most people struggling with these thoughts are not going to be telling people. They may not be telling anybody.
It's true.
Yeah.
And there's a way to do it with a proper tone, without judgment, right? And not like, you know, you ain't serious, are you? Or you really gonna try to, like, really doing it in the way that the person will feel safe.
Yes.
To answer honestly.
Yes.
And I just remember, because even when I was in college, I worked on a youth line that did a lot of suicide calls, took a lot of calls, and we had to be trained in it. And we would have to just ask. And I remember going through the training, and people would say, "Well, if you ask, would it put the thought in their minds?" Like if I asked them, "Are you thinking of committing suicide?" Wouldn't that then give them the idea?
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, no, someone who's not thinking about suicide would not then say, "Huh, that's a
Right.
thought."
Right.
That's
But
not
that
going
is
to
a
be the
common
natural response.
misconception. Yeah. Very
Yeah,
common
so
misconception. Yeah.
it's so good. So now behavior.
And sorry, can you just go back to that slide just for 1 second? Sorry about that.
Sure.
So you also just want to be paying attention to people talking about feeling like they're a burden, right? Because some of the talk is more direct and others is I just feel like I'm a burden to people, feeling trapped in their lives. And again, if they're feeling unbearable physical or emotional pain. Okay. All right. So behavior. So again, we want to look at behavior and often a change in behavior from what we know of this person. So increased use of drugs or alcohol, issues with sleep. So all of a sudden the person's barely sleeping at all, or they're having trouble getting out of bed. They just want to stay in bed all the time. Acting recklessly. So people that are engaging in daredevil type of activities, again, that are not consistent with who they consistently are. Isolating behaviors, looking for ways to kill themselves, right, which is likely on the internet. So that's something family members may want to check, right? What's going on in your children's browsers? What are they looking at? And people who start giving away important possessions. So all red flags.
Wow.
And then mood. And I mean, I think these are pretty self-explanatory. And again, if you look at these words, they're really more intense, right? It doesn't just say sadness, because we're all going to feel sad at different points, right? But depression, apathy, somebody who just like, I don't care about anything anymore, right? Or rage, these really intense feelings. And humiliation is also a big one. So people who are really carrying a lot of shame, these are all things that we just want to pay attention to.
Wow.
Okay, so if you're concerned about somebody, you want to assume you're the only person who's going to reach out. Because sometimes people will say, oh, well, I'm not this person's closest friend. They have people closer than them.
Right.
But you want to assume that you are the only one, right? And especially if we're thinking from a faith perspective, right? There aren't coincidences as accidents with God, right? So he literally may be using you to be the person, to be light in that person's moment of darkness.
Wow. And it's so true. I think sometimes we get intimidated that we wouldn't know what to say or what to do, but we feel like that person might be really needing some help or in trouble. And we're like, well, they do have closer friends, so I'm gonna mind my business. And we keep thinking somebody else would do it. Somebody else is gonna say, and not trust that we are the ones that God is allowing to see what's happening, so that we can be an intervention and an intercession in that moment. So I love that side. This is just trust your gut, trust the Holy Spirit. That's what we're called, the gut, right?
Yeah.
So how to reach out?
Yes. Okay, so this slide is really important because it's literally telling you what you should do if you are concerned about a loved one. So number one, you want to talk to somebody in private, right? So you're not bringing this up at a family dinner, right? You're not bringing it up at an outing with a group of friends. You really want to get somebody one-on-one, and you really want to focus on listening, right? And expressing concern and caring. So, I'm really concerned about you. Something seems different. Tell me what's happening, right? So really focusing on that. And then as Tisa just said, right, the research says you need to ask directly about suicidal thoughts. for people who are not trained therapists, this is very anxiety provoking, right? Well, what if the person says yes, right? But not asking, and they have these suicidal thoughts, right? They could go on to complete. So the research says you want to ask directly. Are you having thoughts of ending your life, right? Or are you having thoughts of wanting to kill yourself? You want to be really, really direct. And then you want to encourage people to seek help, right? We want to think broadly about healing, right? But for a suicidal person, you absolutely need treatment, right? So if they are actively suicidal in the moment, and we can go to the next slide. So these are the 3 things we want to avoid. So now you have a person that's not just saying, well, I feel hopeless, right? Because then we can do a whole bunch of other things. But if they're acknowledging, yes, I am suicidal, you want to avoid minimizing their feelings, because again, the logical part of their brain has shut down. So you don't want to say, well, but it could be worse, right? And I don't know, like you'll probably just snap out of it, but we don't want to do any of that. This is not the time to be trying to convince them that their life is worth living, because that's actually going to make them feel that you don't understand, that you're not listening, right? So that idea that we sometimes try to, now infusing hope before or after the person's suicidal, that's fine. That's important, but not in the moment, right? It's really just listening and being supportive. And then we want to avoid advice to fix it. And I think a helpful way to think about this is, if you came across a loved one who was having a heart attack, right? All of us would do one thing, which is call 911, right? You just, like, this is a crisis. We need to get this person help. And so it's the same with suicidality, right? That this is, with a heart attack, you wouldn't say, well, we've been talking about how you need to start eating healthier. I don't know why you didn't start eating healthier sooner, right? Or you should really have been exercising. Your doctor told you to act. Like, we're not doing any of that. It's just, this is a crisis. We need to get them help. And so it's the same. We want to have that same mindset.
Awesome. It said we're 2 minutes over. So I want us to quickly try to get this last bit out. If we have to do a part 2, we will.
Okay. Yeah. No, and I think we can wrap it up in a couple minutes. So if somebody is actively saying, yes, I want to kill myself, you want to stay with them, right? You're not going to leave anybody alone. If there are any methods around, you want to try to remove that, right? And then you would want to get them to an emergency screening center. For somebody who's actively suicidal, I would not recommend putting them in your car, right? Because that would be, well, if you think about somebody who wants to end their life, now you're driving and they can open the car door, right? So, and again, it depends on how they might be thinking about doing it, but it generally really is best to have an ambulance come.
Wow.
The other exception to that, depending where you are, if you were walking distance from a screening center and you could say, hey, let me walk. I actually had to do that with a friend at one point. And we were able to walk to a screening center, but generally not a good idea to put them in your car. Okay, and these are the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, right? So they have 24-hour phone where you can call in and talk with somebody. And then again, when we think about our younger generation and they're like, I'm not calling anyone, right? There's actually a crisis text line. So these are just really good numbers to have on hand.
Wow. Kristin, thank you so much. I hope you guys are taking the number down if you didn't know it, and taking especially the text number down, because we can't underestimate what this time is doing with our young people, or anybody for that matter, even seniors. So we just have to keep our eye out on everyone, and to also just be upfront if we're struggling ourselves,
Yeah.
right? And to seek help and to um, really be honest about where we are in our emotions and our minds so that we can get the help that we need. We so appreciate you, Kristin, for coming back on Tisa's Vents and Musings. You are our resident therapist, our go-to person. You have come through again and again, and thank you for sharing your story about this and how it's impacted you personally
Yeah.
and why you have been so committed to getting this information out there. Thank you for your service, your volunteerism,
Mhm.
and we hope you will be back with us really soon. But continued success in all that you're doing. And to everyone that's watching, thank you for hanging along with us. We went over about 5 minutes, but we'll be back next week. Again, share this to your page because you just never know who is struggling
Mhm.
and who is thinking at this time, especially during this pandemic, that death is the best answer to get out of the pain that they're struggling.
Yeah.
Prayer is, this doesn't supersede prayer, but sometimes we got to do more than just pray. As my
Yes.
pastor always says, prayer is a
Yeah.
good place to start, but a terrible place to end. So we
Mm.
have to be mindful of people and even ourselves and do all that we can. God wants us to live and to survive and thrive. So good night, everyone. Take care till next week. Thank you, Kristin.
Okay. Good night. Thanks for having